Welcome back to the Joe Walsh Show. A terrible weekend for police officers in America. We'll lead with that. And then, boy, the war on Christians continues in America, this time in Arizona. And finally, San Francisco has a ridiculous solution to a disgusting problem. But first, a tough weekend for cops in America. A Massachusetts police officer shot and killed, Chicago cops injured by protesters, and 3 Kansas City police officers shot at. To discuss this, very pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Randy Sutton, a retired cop associated with a great organization, Blue Lives Matter. Lieutenant Sutton is also a Massachusetts cop in what sounds like just a horrible, horrible attack.
This is a horrible attack that ended with the death of the Weymouth County, the Weymouth police officer. You talked about the Kansas City, 3 officers shot in one incident. In addition to that, a Caldwell, North Carolina police officer was shot this weekend, and in addition to that, another officer was shot in New Mexico. Many of these didn't even make the news because the media doesn't really care about the cops.
Randy, isn't that interesting? Doesn't even make the news. And this Weymouth, Massachusetts police officer, Michael Chesna, shot and killed one day before his 6-year anniversary on the job. An evil thug attacked him with a rock and then shot him in the head and the chest. This war, Randy, on our police officers in this country, here we are almost 4 years after Ferguson, Missouri, and it still continues in earnest, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This is like trying to change the course of a big ship. Under the Obama administration, war was declared on police by the Justice Department and the Obama administration. It catapulted a wave of anti-law enforcement sentiment that is continuing to today, despite the false narratives that were born from the great lie of Ferguson, hands up, don't shoot. But there's a part of this shooting and murder of this Weymouth police officer is even more disturbing than you might think. I want you to picture this. I've gotten, as a radio talk show host for Blue Lives Radio, the voice of American law enforcement and a law enforcement advocate, I have gotten no less than 100 messages from law enforcement officers all over this country about this particular shooting, because the question is, how did the suspect armed with a rock get so close to the officer that he was able to beat him senseless and then take his gun and kill him with it? The investigation has to be done, but I can tell you this, that officers around this country are wondering if the political climate didn't, and also law enforcement administration forcing de-escalation techniques prior to use of force, and if that played a role in the officer not using deadly force in order to save his own life. This is a question that really needs to be answered. It needs to be answered by this police agency, and the investigation needs to be truthful about this situation.
Randy, that's a great point. I was curious about that myself. How, with a rock, did this thug disarm this cop? And you're right, and this is a problem you know so much about. We've tied the hands of our cops all over this country, haven't we?
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you incident after incident of officers who lived, some becoming permanently disabled because they hesitated in using the proper amount of force, not because they were afraid to do it because of any cowardice, but because they knew that if they did use deadly force in some of these situations, they would fall victim to persecution, false prosecution, social media slander, media attention, ruining their families, because this is what is happening all over the country. And this is devastating law enforcement morale as well as their safety, and it needs to be addressed.
Randy, and I remember that there was that female Chicago cop about a year or two ago who held back from shooting a thug because of exactly what you say. She was afraid of the publicity. She was afraid of getting sued, and the thug almost killed her, pounded her into the pavement. Those kinds of things go on all the time. I want to ask you, Randy, about we had this police shooting in Chicago. I've seen the dash cam video. Clearly, these officers look justified in shooting this guy. He was armed. He was going for his gun. And yet you had protests in Chicago, people throwing rocks and bottles at cops all weekend.
Right, right. You know, I of course, review this as a 33-year veteran police officer and a veteran of police combat. I can tell you that from that body-worn cam video that was released, there's no doubt that this was an incredibly justifiable shooting of an individual who was trying to pull his gun out, who was uncooperative, who clearly was a threat to them. But just like the great lie of Ferguson, other narratives have who had a CCW permit and was gunned down by the police. All lies, and it doesn't matter because and let's not call it, they aren't protests, okay? Protests are when civilized people use their right to free speech to talk about something that they disagree with. What we saw here were riots, and the Chicago Police Department was held back by, without a shadow of a doubt, by Rahm Emanuel and his minions, who didn't allow them to do what they should have done, which was wipe up the streets with these guys who were actively throwing dangerous objects that could easily kill or disable a law enforcement officer. Instead, only 4 arrests were made. They should have had the buses filled up with suspects.
Amen. Amen. Randy, I want you to give me a no bull, straight answer, and because I want my entire audience to hear what you're going to say. How bad is the morale for our police officers around the country right now? It's
crushed. I've never seen it this bad. I get communications hundreds of times a week from officers who are lamenting what is going on, who are in essence doing depolicing because they are afraid to get involved, not because of the physical circumstances, but because of the social circumstances. They are more afraid of their police administrations and their own city administrations than they are of the criminals. Things have gotten so out of hand that post-traumatic stress has become an incredibly destructive issue, with law enforcement officers committing suicide at an unprecedented rate. And in fact, I am about to launch an organization called the Wounded Blue, which will assist law enforcement officers with post-traumatic stress after they get injured by the suspects, either physically or emotionally. Many times they are even abandoned by their own police departments in their own cities. So this is a critical issue.
Lieutenant Sutton, God bless you, sir, for what you're doing. Thank you so much. Blue Lives Matter, the author of The Power of Legacy. Randy, thank you so much for joining me. Keep up the good work. Religious freedom is still under attack in America, this time Arizona.